The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. 13th Day. As we have seen, the Lords of Tarsus were Christians sui generis, and if the Church would have discovered their real beliefs, surely they would have condemned as heretics. But they had always cared on their public manner to express their ideas. Far were the times when the house of Tarsus guarded the cult of the cold fire and assumed the obligation of its conservation and diffusion. After the destruction of Tartessos and the oath made by the last men of stone, the priority that they had imposed to themselves consisted in to comply with the familiar mission and save the wise sword, and for it would be necessary to move remaining unnoticed, concentrated only in their objectives. They didn't forget that the wise sword was still waiting in the secret cave, neither the sentence of the Gelims, or Gorn, that's to say, the Hox, as was contemptuously qualified by the Lords of Tarsus, alluding to the sentence written with the blood of the Brayers. Even though the Lords of Tarsus didn't talk about their religious ideas, instead, they acted, and they made it ostensibly, to attract the attention of their exemplary behavior and to divert it from controversial thoughts. The great ignorance that characterized the clerics and bishops of that age favored them to a great extent. They were only fixed in the exterior part of the cult and in the obedience and faith demonstrated by the believers. And, in that sense, the house of Tarsus constituted a Christian family. They were rich landowners, but very humble and virtuous, always working their properties in Huelvic, past great part of the year in the campaign. They generously helped the church and maintained, in the village of Tarsus, a basilica consecrated to the Holy Virgin. They even formed, with the people of the hamlet of Tours, a minor order, audience, in charge of the exposition of the gospel to the catechumens who would be baptized. Yes, the Church could be proud of the house of Tarsus. Really, the Lords of Tarsus didn't lie in this due to, they affirmed that the most pure image of the new Christianity was the Virgin Mary. For this reason, in the middle of the 3rd century, they transformed the Roman basilica where they officiated the cult of Vesta, in a Christian ecclesia. They conserved the edifice intact, but they replaced the statue of Vesta, and they constructed an altar to celebrate the Eucharist, where they deposited also the perennial lamp. When it was possible, the Lords of Tarsus tried to make that the chapel be attended always by clerics of the family, although due to its importance it received periodic visits of the Bishop of Seville and the presbyteries of the surroundings. The chosen worship for the cult of the Virgin had an edifying origin due to the own Lords of Tarsus. When they had presented before the Christian priests, they made it assuring that they had witnessed a manifestation of the Virgin. According to them, the Virgin had appeared in a shallow grotto situated a few meters from the village of Tours, case that could be attested by all the members of the family and some servants. The Virgin had shown herself in the splendor of her majesty and had asked them to worship her divine Son and to remember her with a cult. Then the Lords of Tarsus, visible prey of excitation, declared that they wanted to abandon the pagan cult and became Christians. The voluntary conversion of such powerful Roman Hispanic family caused great satisfaction to the Catholic priests, due to it would add exemplary prestige to their evangelizing missions in the region. Thence, they accepted willingly the initiative of the house of Tarsus, occulted behind the sculpture with which they replaced the Vesta's statue. Things had overly changed since the age of the Carthaginiensis. Now the village counted of an enormous seigneurial residence in the Tradominicata and with some 50 hectares of Tra in Dominicata, given to the cultivation. A peasant door, also called village of Tours, had been erected near to the residence of the Lords of Tarsus, and in the limit of the door, over a hill which smoothly descended to the seigneurial residence, the Lords of Tarsus had destined for the local church and parish an excellent Roman basilica. The catechumens, who were going to hear the Miss Catechumenarum, and the faithfuls, who then would assist to the particular Miss Fidelium, reached to the atrium, a garden surrounded by columns, and they passed beside a fount called Cantharus, before entering the central nave. Constructed over a rectangular level, the basilica had 3 naves, two lateral naves that formed the cross, and a central nave was divided by two columns of seats, occupied, in the right side by men and the left, by women. The central nave ended in the apse, a vaulted widening and elevated where was the sanctuarium. Normally, in every church of that time, at the bottom of the apse was the episcopal cathedral, as will be seen immediately, had been assigned to the Holy Virgin. In front of the episcopal cathedral, in the core of the sanctuary, was the sacrum and saya of the altar and, over it, the instruments of the cult, the chalice, the paten, and the perennial lamp. The culminating moment of the Mass of the Faithfuls take place immediately after the pronunciation of the Eucharistic words of the priest. Then he recites the Pilices, an invocation to the Holy Spirit, soliciting its presence, to propitiate the miracle of the transmutation of the bread and the wine, and draw a little curtain which leaves exposed, to the faithful's sight, the divine image of the Virgin. The faithfuls were absorbed in the contemplation. The sculpture of the Virgin is of painted wood, of smallest dimensions, 70 centimeters of elevation, 30 of width and 30 of depth. She is seated, in a majestic attitude, over a cathedra made also of wood. Her countenance is of beautiful occidental factions, because she was a reproduction of one of the ladies of Tarsus, and smiles smoothly while her eyes are fixed directly ahead. Her hair falls down in the form of 16 braids finely carved, which emerge immediately from under the crown. Because even she, as the child, exhibits the attributes of the royal dignity. Both crowns are triple and octagonal. In regard to the child, he is seated on her lap, over the left knee, while she lovingly sustains him from his shoulders with the left hand. In difference to the sculpture of the Virgin, which is of painted wood, the child one is of white stone. Virgin of wood, child of stone. The countenance of the Virgin is painted of immaculate white, the hair of gold, the body of red and the cathedra of black. With the right hand, the Virgin wields a bundle of 16 spikes of wheat and a birch rod. With the left hand she holds the child. Her foot are separated, as her knees, and beneath her right foot can be seen, crushed, the head of a serpent. The child Christus King, on his part, looks fixed ahead, in the same direction of his Divine Mother, and has a book in the left hand while with the right he realizes a gesture that stands out the straight angle between the fingers index and thumb. It is evident why to the worship was given the name of the White Virgin of the Child of Stone, or Our Lady of the Grotto, due to, apart from the mention made by the Lords of Tarsus, about the place of the apparition of the Virgin, the grotto, not intervened at all in the cult. But the case was that the Virgin, whose description I just made, represented clearly to Emma, the mother of Nathan, to whom the White Atlantans called the Virgin of Catawba, because they pretended that she was still in the city of the liberator gods. But what means Catawba? Is an agglutination of three ancient words. The first HK, from which is only conserved the final K, that was for the White Atlantans, a generic name of God. With HK, they used to refer to the unknowable, and also to the liberator gods. The second is Ta, or Ta, which means city. But not any city but Hyperborean city, city of the White Atlantans. And the third is Gr, or Ga, which is equivalent to crypt, grotto, or underground enclosure. So, Catawba means, approximately, the underground city of the liberator gods. With the suppression of the K, and the transposition of the rest words, other populations have referred to the same city as Agartha, Agartha, or Agartha, which means literally underground city. The Virgin of Catawba is also that Virgin of Agartha. But Agartha can be interpreted as the grotto. In this form appears the real origin of the ingenious denomination Our Lady of the Grotto that the Lords of Tarsus adopted to refer openly to the Virgin of Agartha. In sum, when the imperial law of 392, that repressed the practice of the pagan cults was dictated, the Lords of Tarsus were already Christians, Catholic Romans, and sustained in their ecclesiae proprie the cult to Our Lady of the Grotto, the Virgin of Agartha. It doesn't mean that with this change they renounced to the cult of the cold fire. In reality, to celebrate such cult was not required any image. was the figurative necessity of the Lydians what, when perfectioning the form of the cult, introduced, in the past, the image of Pyrene. But Pyrene was the cold fire, in the heart, and her simpler representation consisted in the perennial lamp. To the goddess chosen ones, to those who still believed in her promise, would be enough with the perennial lamp, because the end of the ritual and the test of the cold fire had to be realized internally. Thereby, all the ancient mystery of the cold fire was exposed to the sight in such basilica at the village of THIRTEENTH. But, as before, as always, only the men of stone understood it. Only they knew, when praying in the chapel, that the gaze of Virgin of Agatha and of the Child of Stone were nailed in the flame of the perennial lamp, and that such dancing flame was Pyrene, was Freya, the wife of Natan, expressing with her dance the secret of the death. In the beginnings of the 4th century, 3 barbarous populations assaulted Spain. 2 were German, the Suevi, and the Vandals, and the other, the Alans, Iranian. In the distribution that they made, the Alans occupied Lusitania and part of Boeotia, including the region of the village of THIRTEENTH, reached to be in 409, and, in the 8 years that they obtained to stay in the region, their presence is reduced to the usufruct in the own benefit of the taxation correspondent to the Roman functionaries and the periodic looting of some villages. To face the invasion, the Roman general Constantius, in the name of the Emperor Honorius, contracts the King Wellia, of the Visigoths through a Foetus, signed in the year 416. By this treaty the Visigoths agreed to fight, in quality of federated at the empire, against the barbarians that occupy Spain, receiving in turn lands to establish in the south of the Gaul, in the Tarraconensis and in the Narbonensis. The Alans were rapidly annihilated, while the Vandals didn't realize incursions to the Boeotia yet, until they finally abandoned the peninsula to Africa. When in 476 the Odoacer deposes the Roman Emperor Augustulus, giving in to the Western Roman Empire, from 5 years ago that the Visigothic king Euric was occupying Spain. This time, the Visigoths entered to finish with the Suevis, in fulfillment of the Foetus of the year 418, but they would not leave for the next 200 years. The permanent presence of the Visigoths in Spain not affected in a determinate manner the lives of the Hispanic Romans, except in the case of the owners of great estates latifundiums, that were obeyed by the Foetus, to distribute their lands with the German guests. Such was the case of the lords of Tharsis, when they had to host a Visigothic family, named VILLCA, and to give them 1/3 of the Tredominicata, and 2/3 of the Tredominicata. But after this expropriation, that constituted a fair payment for the tranquility that the Visigoths family, assured in front of the recent invasions, all continued as the days of the Roman Empire. Only the destiny of taxes had changed, which was not Roman anymore but more closer to the telida. The amount and the periodicity of the exaction, and even the collective functionaries, were the same that in the Roman Empire. 3 fundamental points separated from a beginning the Visigoths and the Hispanic Romans. A law that prohibited the marriages between Goths and Hispanic Romans, the religious difference, and the numeric proportion between both populations. The first was solved in the year 580, with the annulment of the law, remaining open the barrier that impeded to mix both populations. Since then, Velta's family, integrates with many marriages to the house of Tharsis, remained restoring the primitive patrimony of the lords of Tharsis. The second point means that, while the totality of the Hispanic Roman dwellers professed the Catholic religion, the Visigoths guests maintained the Arianism. In fact, both populations were Christians and ignorant of the theological quibblings that the priests established dogmatically. And in this case, the difference that Arius had signalized was of extreme subtlety. The Visigoths were evangelized, when they still inhabited in the shores of the Black Sea, by the Goth bishop Ulfilas, devotee of Arius. Then, when advancing through Occident, pushed by the Huns, would discover with satisfaction that their Christianity was different from the Roman, and they would hang on tenaciously to that difference, often incomprehensible. They would work in this form, Because the Goths had developed in great grade their national pride, and they needed to dispose of some tangible difference, a known unifying principle, which would avoid them to be culturally phagocytized by the Roman Empire. The meaning of the difference itself had no major importance. The concrete would be that the Arianism would maintain them religiously separated from the Roman population in such way that when joining each other would allow them to conserve the Gothic culture. In what consisted such difference with the Catholic dogma that only a few understood, but the nationalist Goths would defend it to the end? Specifically, it referred to a definition concerning to a problem of the divinity and Jesus Christ. The posture of Arius, natal of Libya but enrolled in the Diocese of Antioquia, appeared as a reaction against the doctrine of Sabellius. He affirmed that not existed an essential distinction amongst the three persons of the Christian Trinity. The Son and the Holy Spirit were really manifestations of the Father under other aspect or person. The essence of the God One, when was presented with one aspect of the Father, with other was the child, and with other the Holy Spirit. Against this, Arius started to teach since 318, that only God One is eternal and incommunicable. Jesus Christ was created from the naught, therefore, he is not eternal. He is a creature of the God One, hence something different from him, something not consubstantial with him. Sabellius didn't establish any distinction within the three persons of this Trinity, whereas Arius differentiated in such way the Father and the Son that he was not God anymore nor consubstantial with the Father. Both would be condemned as heretics for the Catholic doctrine. And what was the truth? According to what was decided in Nicaea, in 325, a council of 300 bishops, Jesus Christ answered to the formula consubstantialis Petri, that is to say, he was consubstantial with the Father, of his same substance, God as him. Thence, the religious difference that separated Goths and Romans treated about the complex concept of the consubstantiality between God and the Verb of God, difference that would not reach to explain the Goths, obstinacy at least that could be considered that with this was preserving a culture, a tradition, and a lifestyle. Perhaps it would not be evidenced on its real dimension the danger of immersion in the Roman culture that was denounced by the nationalist Goths, if it is not repaired in the third point, about the numeric disproportion between both populations. Because the Visigoths only counted 200,000, it means that a community of 200,000 members, just arrived, had to dominate a native population of 9 millions of Hispanic Romans, exponents of a high grade of civilization. At the light of such quantities it is better understood the reticence of the Goths to suppress the religious and juristic differences that isolated them from the Hispanic Romans. The reality of their scarce number forced the Visigoths to tolerate the religion of the Hispanic Romans, although without ceding an apex in their Arian convictions. However, even by the desperation of the nationalists, the universality in the time of the world which was Roman and Catholic was penetrating them from everywhere, and finally they had to accept a cultural integration that, indeed, was already consummated. In the year 589, the king Reccared became Catholic during the Three Council of Toledo, fulfilling the religious unification of the populations of Spain. Being the Goths an Indo-Germanic race, that was counted amongst the last one who abandoned the pact of blood, that is to say, who were amongst the ones of pure blood of the earth, it is easy to conclude that their presence in the peninsula could only benefit to the house of Tharsis. But such step taken by Reccared would elevate, now without obstacles, the lords of Tharsis to the most noble dignities of the court of Toledo. Since the 7th century the ones from Tuxvelta would be Visigoths counts. The political unification of Spain completed by his father, the king Leovigild, and the religious unification carried out by Reccared would leave unveiled the internal enemy that, until then, had thrived with the differences that separated both populations. It was about the members of the chosen people, by Jehovah Satan, who professed to the Gentiles, that's to say, to those who not belong to the chosen people, an inextinguishable hate analogous to the one that Gelms feel against the house of Tharsis. Even though the last Christianity the one of Jesus Christ, registered at the clear origin of their sacred books, their traditions, their synagogues, and rabbis. They depreciated it and explained its existence as a necessary evil, as the fable that would put in evidence the moral due truth. The false Catholic Christianity would last until the advent of the Jewish Messiah, the real Christ, who would sit in the throne of the world and would submit all the populaces of the earth to the slavery of the Jews. This was a prophecy that would be relentlessly accomplished, just as countless rabbis and doctors of the law assured in the Talmud. They blindly believed that the diaspora had, as finality, to infiltrate them amongst the Gentile populations as some kind of mystical preparation for the future that would come, for the universal restoration of the temple of Jehovah Satan, and the resurrection of the house of Israel, the real Jewish Messiah. During the dispersion, the Gentiles would learn who are the Jews, the expression of the God One on the earth, and the Jews would demonstrate to the Gentiles what is the power of the God One. In all diaspora, and in such Sephard of Spain, the Jews, persuaded by their messianic leadership, were determined to undermine by any means the social fundaments of the Gentile populations. The religion, the moral, the royal and nobility institutions, the economy, and every legal base, suffered systematic attacks by the members of the chosen people. Recherd had to act against them due to the evidence of their indefatigable corrupting task, but the successors of such king didn't work with the necessary energy and allowed the Jews to proceed with their plans. The king Sisbt, extraordinary warrior and jealous Christian, who defeated successively the Basques, Cantabri, Skens, Asturianos, and Byzantine Greeks, had to correct the situation. In April of 612 he dictates a law that prohibits to the Jews the possession of Christian slaves. You must not forget, Dr. Setonal, the profound irony that implicated such prohibition from the theological perspective, considering that the Talmudic prophecies announced the prompt enslavement of Christians and Goyim. Of course, to the juridical effects, the law was regulated, aiming to particular slaves, and in this manner was ordained that to every Jew surprised in possession of a Christian slave, after July 1 of 612 all his goods would be confiscated and to the slave would be conceded the freedom as a Roman citizen. Also became effective, by the same law, a disposition from the times of Alaric II, who executed the Jews who had converted a Christian to their religion, even in sons of intermarriage. When Sisbt died, in 633, is gathered the Forecouncil of Toledo, where assisted the Count of Farsis, in quality of local bishop. Their many themes were treated, as the royal succession, the cases of sedition, the rules for the ecclesiastical discipline, etc. And on it was debated mainly of what concerned to the Jewish problem. The king Sisan, and who chaired the council, with a complete lack of the strategic skills and the Hyperborean vision of Sisbt, allowed pro-Jew faction to take the main voice and to question the measures recently decreed against the chosen people. Is there when the Count of Tuxvelta faces violently against the Bishop Isidore of Seville, who not possessed neither remotely the pure blood of Recherd or Sisbt, nevertheless he was one of the best instructed and more intelligent men of Spain. His encyclopedia at 20 tomes Etymology is a masterwork for the age, apart from many books dedicated to the most varied themes. He even wrote a treatise of apologetics with the suggested title, De Fide Catholica against Ladinos. However, Isidore professed admiration with no limits for the history of the chosen people and considered the Old Testament as the theological base of Christianity, just as is demonstrated in his treatise of exegetics Legoriae Scriptura, where he comments the Hebrew books. This posture guided him to the contradiction of sustaining in one hand the necessity to fight against Judaism and in the other to procure the defense of the Jews, to avoid that any type violence be put over them. In the course of the council, moved by that false Christian mercy, he tried to retrace the laws of the Visigoth kings. Thanks to the intervention of the Count of Tuxvelta, are approved 10 canons about the Jews, but without the rigor of Sisbt's law. Was prohibited to the Jews, among other things, the practice of the usury, the performance of public offices, the mixed marriages, was ordered the dissolution of the existent mixed marriages, and was reaffirmed the prohibition to maintain Christian slaves. To evaluate the importance of the adopted resolutions, it just has to be noticed that the councils of Toledo were national synods of the Catholic Church, just as to the nobles, who were responsible as the general of the laws, in case that they didn't accomplish with exactitude a dedication to the dispositions about the Jews. In the Council of Toledo, the Count of Tuxvelta defended with ardor the cause that he denominated Goth Hispanic culture, in a moment in which the pro-Jew faction, headed by the Bishop Isidore, seemed to have controlled the dispute. His eruption was decisive. He spake with such eloquence that achieved to define the majority of the bishops in favor to take urgent measures to counteract the Jewish problem. All were fascinated, especially the noble Visigoths, when they heard to assure that the Goth Hispanic culture was oldest of the earth, and that now that invaluable heritage was threatened by a population enemy of the spirit, a population who worshipped Satan in secrecy and counted with their infernal power to enslave or destroy mankind. Satan had conferred power over the gold that they always used to carry out their uncontestable plans, and which they surely used to bought the vote of the bishops that defended them. This possibility to be at the service of the Jewish gold took to more than one pro-Jew bishop to shut his mouth and allowed that, finally, the expected measures by the Count of Tuxvelta were approved. However, such victory was not positive for the House of Farsis, due to it revealed something that was unnoted by all the world up to that moment. The attitude that the Count of Tuxvelta was exuded something more than the Catholic zeal, something alive, something that could only proceed from a secret knowledge, from an occult source. The Earl was extremely sure of what he was affirming, was rather categorical in his conviction, to be a fanatic, to be someone blinded by the faith. It was evident that the Earl knew what he said, but how much and what did he know? Whither did his wisdom come? Thence, the House of Farsis would be observed again by the enemy, and to the hate of the Gelims would be added now the one of the chosen people and of some part of the Catholic Church, who would not stop to pursue the Lord of Farsis, and procure their destruction. Since that moment, even if they would contribute with their riches and members to the strengthening of the Church, the House of Farsis would be always suspicious of heresy.